Say you're my wife." His voice was low, controlled, but something underneath it trembled just enough to make her heart forget how to beat as his hand pressed against the wall beside her, not touching her skin, not yet, but close enough that she could feel the warmth he had denied her for 3 years. Lily Harper didn't move, didn't breathe, because this version of Ethan Caldwell did not exist in the life she had learned to survive. The man who stood in front of her now was not the distant millionaire who had married her and then vanished into silence. He was something else, something dangerous in a quiet way, something that looked at her like she mattered, and that scared her more than his coldness ever did. 3 years earlier, the marriage had been nothing more than signatures and expectations, a contract drawn between families who valued power over love, and Ethan had made one thing clear without ever needing to say it out loud. He would give her his name, his house, his protection, but never himself, never his touch, never his heart. And Lily, soft and patient and far too understanding for her own good, had nodded as if that was enough, as if being chosen on paper could fill the empty spaces inside her. The Caldwell estate was larger than anything she had ever imagined, with tall windows that let in pale morning light and long hallways that echoed with footsteps that were never his. And somewhere in that house was a room that belonged to her, a room he had never entered, a door that stayed closed not because it was locked, but because it had never been opened by him. And over time, Lily stopped expecting it to be. She learned the rhythm of silence, the way the air felt different when he was home, yet still unreachable, the way dinner plates were cleared without conversation, the way his presence was always just out of reach, like a shadow that refused to take shape. She wore the ring every day, a simple band that should have meant something, but it always felt cold against her skin, like a reminder of a promise that had never been real. And sometimes she would catch herself staring at it, wondering what it would feel like if it meant more, if it meant him. But those thoughts were dangerous, so she buried them the same way she buried everything else. Ethan Caldwell was known to the world as a man who built empires without hesitation, who made decisions without emotion, who never looked back. And inside this marriage, he was exactly the same, precise, distant, untouchable, until tonight. Until this moment where the space between them had vanished and his eyes were no longer empty but searching, intense, almost uncertain, and Lily felt something shift in the air, something fragile and heavy at the same time, like the first crack in ice that had been frozen too long. She should have stepped away, should have reminded herself that this wasn't real, that people like him didn't suddenly change, but her feet stayed where they were, her fingers tightening slightly at her sides as she looked up at him. Really looked at him for the first time in a way she had never allowed herself to before. And in that quiet, suspended second, she realized the truth that would change everything. The man who had never touched her for 3 years was now the one who couldn't seem to let her go. The first time Lily Harper realized she had stopped waiting for him was not dramatic. It did not come with tears or anger. It came quietly one morning as she stood by the kitchen window, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, watching the early light stretch across the empty garden, while the house behind her remained still, untouched by his presence even though she knew he had come home sometime past midnight. Because that was how it always was. Ethan Caldwell moved through her life, like a ghost with weight, visible in traces but never in moments, and at some point, without noticing exactly when, she had learned to live around that absence instead of hoping it would change. 3 years had a way of reshaping expectations, of smoothing out sharp edges until even disappointment felt familiar, and Lily had become someone who no longer listened for footsteps outside her door, no longer looked up when a car pulled into the driveway, no longer wondered if tonight would be different. She simply existed within the quiet rules of a marriage that asked nothing from her except presence, and even that felt optional most days. The staff treated her with careful respect, calling her Mrs. Caldwell in soft voices, but there was always a distance in their eyes, as if they understood something she tried not to name, that she was a wife in title only, a figure placed into a role that had never truly been filled. And Lily never corrected that unspoken understanding because it was easier than explaining a truth she did not fully understand herself. Sometimes she would pass Ethan in the hallway, their schedules overlapping just enough to acknowledge each other with a brief glance, a nod, nothing more, his eyes always calm, unreadable, as if she were simply part of the structure of the house, like a piece of furniture that had always been there. And in those moments, she felt something small inside her go quiet, not breaking, just settling deeper into stillness. The ring on her finger had become part of that stillness, its weight constant, its meaning distant, and she often found herself turning it slowly without thinking, as if searching for warmth that was never there, until even that habit faded and the ring became just another detail she stopped noticing. It was not that Ethan was cruel. He never raised his voice, never dismissed her in a way that could be called harsh. He simply did not reach for her in any way, and over time, that absence became its own kind of boundary, one she respected without question because it felt safer than crossing into a space where she was not wanted. But something had shifted recently, something so subtle at first that she almost convinced herself she imagined it. A pause that lasted a second too long when their paths crossed, a glance that lingered just enough to feel different, a presence that felt less distant even when he said nothing at all. And Lily did not know what to do with that change because it unsettled the balance she had carefully built, the quiet acceptance that had allowed her to survive this life without asking for more. Earlier that evening, she had been in the sitting room, reading without really following the words, when she heard his footsteps stop outside the doorway, not passing by as usual, just stopping, and for a moment neither of them moved, the air between them filled with something unfamiliar, something unspoken, until he finally stepped in, his gaze finding her in a way that felt almost deliberate. And Lily felt that same strange shift again, like the ground beneath her had softened without warning, because for the first time in 3 years, it felt as if Ethan Caldwell was no longer looking through her, but at her, and she had no idea what that meant or what it would cost her if it was real. It started with something so small that Lily almost ignored it, the sound of her own laughter echoing too brightly in a place that had forgotten what it meant, and for a second she did not even recognize it as her own, because it had been so long since anything had reached her that way, soft and unexpected, like sunlight slipping through a window that had always stayed closed. She had stepped outside the estate that afternoon, something she rarely did without a reason, telling herself she needed fresh air. But in truth, she needed distance, just a little space where she did not feel like a quiet detail in someone else's life. And it was there, near the edge of the long gravel driveway, that she ran into Daniel Reeves, a consultant who had been working with the Caldwell Company for a few weeks, someone she had seen once or twice in passing, but never really spoken to, until now. He greeted her with an easy smile, the kind that did not carry weight or expectation, and asked a simple question about the garden, about the roses that lined the path, and Lily found herself answering, then explaining, then laughing softly when he admitted he knew nothing about plants but liked how peaceful it felt here, and the conversation stayed light, unimportant, but warm in a way she had not felt in years. And for a brief moment, she forgot the quiet rules she lived by, forgot the careful way she kept her voice low and her presence smaller than it needed to be. Inside the house, Ethan had returned earlier than usual, his schedule shifting without explanation, and he moved through the familiar spaces with the same controlled steps, removing his jacket, loosening his tie slightly, everything precise, everything measured, until he noticed something that did not belong, a sound drifting in through the open window, soft but distinct, a woman's laugh, her laugh, and it made him pause in a way that felt unfamiliar, his hand stilling for just a second as his attention shifted towards something he had not been listening for before. He walked closer to the window without thinking, his gaze settling outside where Lily stood beneath the fading afternoon light, her posture relaxed, her expression open in a way he had never seen directed at him. And beside her stood a man he recognized only vaguely, someone from work, someone who should have been irrelevant, and yet the sight of them standing close enough to share a quiet moment pressed against something inside him that he had kept sealed for years. He did not name the feeling, did not try to understand it, but it stayed there, sharp and unexpected, as he watched the way her eyes softened when she spoke, the way her hands moved gently as she explained something, the way she seemed present, fully there, not the distant version of her that moved through the house like a careful shadow. Lily did not notice him at first, too caught in the simple ease of being seen without expectation, without silence, until something shifted in the air, a quiet awareness that made her glance toward the house. And when her eyes met his through the window, the moment fractured instantly. The warmth fading as something else took its place, something uncertain, something fragile, because Ethan Caldwell was looking at her, not through her, not past her, but directly at her. His expression unreadable, but his gaze steady in a way that made her heart tighten, and for the first time, she wondered if the distance between them had not been empty after all, but waiting for something neither of them had ever allowed to begin. That evening did not return to silence the way it always had. Something had already shifted, and it refused to settle back into place. And Lily felt it in the smallest details, in the way the air inside the house felt heavier, in the way her own steps sounded too loud against the polished floor as she walked back inside after saying goodbye to Daniel, her smile fading before she even reached the door, as if it did not belong here. She told herself it was nothing, just a moment, just a conversation that meant less than it felt. But the image of Ethan standing by the window stayed with her, the way his eyes held hers without looking away, without softening, and for reasons she could not explain. It made her chest feel tight in a way she had never felt around him before. Dinner that night was different, not in what was said, because almost nothing was said, but in what was not avoided. Ethan sat across from her as usual, composed, precise, but his attention did not drift the way it always had. It stayed, steady and quiet, resting on her in a way that made it impossible to ignore, and Lily found herself lowering her gaze more than once, her fingers lightly tightening around the edge of her glass just to ground herself in something familiar. "You went outside today," he said finally, his voice calm, almost neutral, but it broke through the silence like something deliberate, and Lily looked up, surprised not by the question but by the fact that he had noticed at all, that he had chosen to speak. "Yes," she answered softly, unsure why it felt like she needed to be careful, as if the wrong word might disturb something fragile between them. He nodded once, slow, his eyes still on her, and for a moment it seemed like he would say more, but instead he remained quiet, and somehow that felt heavier than any question. The rest of the evening moved in that same strange rhythm, not quite distant, not quite close, something in between that neither of them knew how to navigate, until later, when Lily turned down the hallway toward her room, expecting the night to end the way it always did, separate, untouched, unchanged. She reached for the handle of her door, her fingers brushing the cool metal, when a presence behind her made her pause. Not a sound, not a word, just the awareness of him there, closer than he had ever stood before without reason, and her breath caught slightly as she turned, her eyes meeting his in the dim light. Ethan stood just a step away, his expression unreadable but not empty, not anymore, and the space between them felt smaller than it should have been, charged with something quiet and unspoken. For a second, neither of them moved, and then his hand lifted, slow, controlled, as if he was testing something he did not fully understand, and before she could think, before she could step back, his fingers closed gently around her wrist, not tight, not forceful, just enough to stop her from turning away, and that single point of contact sent a warmth through her that felt unfamiliar, almost startling after years of nothing. Lily's heart began to beat faster, her mind trying to catch up with what was happening, because this was the line that had never been crossed, the boundary that had always defined them, and now it was gone, replaced by the quiet weight of his touch and the way his gaze held hers without hesitation. "Who was he?" Ethan asked, his voice low, steady, but carrying something beneath it that had never been there before, something that sounded dangerously close to something human, something real, and Lily realized in that moment that whatever had shifted between them was not going to fade back into silence, because for the first time, Ethan Caldwell was no longer standing at a distance. He was stepping into her space, and he was not letting go. His fingers did not tighten, but they did not let go either, and that was what made it impossible for Lily to ignore, because in 3 years Ethan Caldwell had never held her like this, never stopped her from walking away, never asked a question that sounded like it mattered. Her wrist felt warm under his touch, a quiet, steady heat that spread slowly through her arm and settled somewhere deep in her chest, making it hard to think clearly as she looked up at him, searching for something in his expression that could explain what was happening. But all she found was that same unreadable calm with something new beneath it, something that felt close to tension, like a line pulled too tight. "He works with your company," she answered softly, her voice steady even though her heart was not, because she did not want to turn this into something it was not, did not want to give weight to a moment that might disappear as quickly as it had appeared. Ethan's gaze did not shift, not even for a second, as if her answer was not enough, as if there was something else he was measuring, something he could not quite define but refused to ignore. "You seemed comfortable," he said after a moment, the words sounding unfamiliar in his voice, like something he had not used in a long time, and Lily felt a quiet confusion rise inside her, because she did not understand why that mattered, why he would notice something so small when he had ignored everything else for years. She let out a soft breath, her eyes lowering briefly before returning to his, and there was no accusation in her tone, only honesty that had been built slowly over time. "It was just a conversation," she said, simple, unguarded, because that was all it had been. And yet the way he looked at her made it feel like more. The silence that followed was different from the ones before, not empty, not distant, but full of something neither of them knew how to name. And for the first time, Lily felt uncertain in a way she had never felt with him, because this was unfamiliar territory, a space where the rules had changed without warning. His hand shifted slightly, not releasing her, just adjusting, his thumb brushing lightly against her skin in a movement so small it could have been accidental. But it was not, and that brief contact sent a quiet shiver through her, not from fear, but from the sudden awareness of him, of the fact that he was real and present in a way he had never been before. Ethan seemed to notice it too, the way her breath caught, the way her posture stilled, and something in his expression tightened for just a second before smoothing out again. But he did not step back, did not return to the safe distance he had always kept. "You are my wife," he said, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a calm certainty that felt heavier than anything else he had ever said to her. And Lily felt those words settle into the space between them, unfamiliar and almost unreal, because he had never said them like that before, never claimed them in a way that sounded personal. Her lips parted slightly, as if to respond, but no words came, because she did not know what to say to something that felt both overdue and completely unexpected, something that should have been normal but was not. For a long second, they stood there in the quiet hallway, his hand still around her wrist, her heart still trying to understand what had changed, until slowly, almost reluctantly, he let go, his fingers slipping away as if the contact had lasted longer than he intended, but the warmth remained, lingering in a way that made it impossible to forget. Lily turned toward her door again, her hand hovering over the handle, but she did not open it right away, because she could still feel his presence behind her, still sense that invisible shift that had begun to reshape everything she thought she understood about this marriage. And as she finally stepped inside and closed the door, one thought stayed with her, quiet but undeniable. Something had started tonight, something that would not return to silence, because Ethan Caldwell had crossed a line he had held for 3 years, and now neither of them knew how to go back. The next morning did not feel like the ones before, even though everything looked exactly the same. The same pale light stretching across the floor, the same quiet hum of a house that rarely held conversation, the same routine Lily had followed for 3 years without thinking. And yet something inside her refused to settle back into that familiar stillness, because the memory of his hand around her wrist had not faded overnight. It stayed, warm and unsettling, like a question she could not answer. She moved through the kitchen slowly, her fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that she barely tasted, her mind replaying the moment again and again, trying to understand what it meant, trying to convince herself that it did not mean anything at all, that it was just a passing shift, a temporary change that would disappear as quickly as it came, because that was safer, easier, less dangerous than believing it was real. But then she heard his footsteps, steady and unhurried, entering the room without hesitation, and something in her chest tightened before she could stop it, her body reacting before her thoughts could catch up, because Ethan did not come here in the mornings, not when she was here, not when it would require him to share space that had always been hers alone. She looked up as he stepped inside, his presence filling the quiet in a way that felt different now, heavier, more aware, and for a second neither of them spoke. The silence stretching between them, but no longer empty, no longer distant. "You are leaving today," he said, his voice calm, not a question, but a statement that made her pause, her brows drawing together slightly in confusion because she had not told him, had not mentioned anything about her plans, and yet he knew. "I was going to visit the clinic," she replied after a moment, her tone careful but honest, because there was no reason to hide it. She had been volunteering there for months. A small place just outside the city where no one cared about names or status, where she could exist without being defined by a title that had never truly belonged to her. Ethan nodded once, his gaze steady on her, as if confirming something he had already decided, and then, without hesitation, he reached for his keys on the counter, the small metallic sound echoing softly in the quiet room. "I will drive you," he said, simple, direct. And Lily felt her breath catch slightly because that was not something he had ever offered before, not something he had ever done, and for a moment she did not know how to respond, her instincts telling her to refuse, to keep the distance that had always protected her from expecting more. But something else held her back, something quieter, more uncertain. "You do not have to," she said gently, her fingers tightening slightly around her cup. But he shook his head once, already moving toward the door, as if the decision had been made without needing her agreement. "I know," he answered, and there was something in the way he said it that left no room for argument, not forceful, not controlling, just certain. The drive was quiet, but not the same kind of quiet she had grown used to. This silence felt aware, filled with unspoken thoughts that neither of them voiced, the space between them smaller than it had ever been, his presence close enough that she could feel it without looking. And once, just once, when the car slowed at a red light, she caught him glancing at her, not quickly, not by accident, but deliberately, his eyes lingering for a second longer than necessary before returning to the road. Lily turned her gaze toward the window, her reflection faint against the glass, her heart beating a little faster than it should, because she did not understand what was happening, did not understand why everything felt like it was shifting all at once. Why the man who had never reached for her was now stepping into every space she had quietly claimed as her own. When they arrived, he did not leave immediately, his hand resting lightly on the steering wheel as he looked toward the small building ahead, then back at her, and for a moment it felt like he might say something, something important, something that could explain all of this. But instead he simply said, "I will pick you up," his voice low, steady, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. And Lily realized then that this was no longer a moment, no longer a passing change. This was something deeper, something deliberate, because Ethan Caldwell was not stepping back, he was stepping in, and this time, he was not asking for permission. The clinic had always been the one place where Lily could breathe without thinking, a small building with soft white walls and the quiet rhythm of people helping each other without asking who they were outside those doors, and for months it had been her escape. A place where her name did not carry weight and her silence did not feel like absence. But today, even here, something followed her, something she could not leave behind, because every time she paused, every time her hands stilled between tasks, her mind returned to the same question she had been avoiding since the night before. Why now? Why him? And what would happen if she let herself believe it meant something? She moved gently between patients, offering warm smiles, steady hands, listening more than she spoke, and yet there was a distance in her focus that had not been there before, a quiet distraction that softened the edges of everything around her, until a familiar voice pulled her back, light and easy, cutting through her thoughts with a kind of effortlessness she had almost forgotten. "You look like you were somewhere else today," Daniel said, leaning lightly against the doorway, his tone gentle but observant, and Lily blinked once before offering a small smile, one that did not quite reach her eyes the way it had. "Yesterday, just a long morning," she replied, simple, safe, because explaining the truth felt too complicated, too uncertain, and she was not ready to give words to something she did not understand. Daniel studied her for a second, not pushing, not questioning further, just present in a way that felt kind rather than intrusive, and it reminded her of how easy it had been to talk to him, how natural it had felt to laugh without thinking, and for a brief moment, she wondered what it would be like to live in a world where things were always that simple. The day moved slowly after that. each hour stretching just enough to make her aware of time in a way she usually was not. And as the sun began to lower, casting a soft golden light through the windows, Lily felt a quiet tension settle into her chest, because she knew he would come. He had said he would. And something about that certainty made it impossible to ignore what was happening between them. When she finally stepped outside, the air cooler now, the sky painted in soft shades of fading light. She saw his car waiting near the curb, exactly where he said it would be, and her steps slowed just slightly, not from hesitation, but from the weight of what it represented, the fact that he had followed through, that he had chosen to be here, again. Ethan was already out of the car when she approached, his posture composed as always, but his attention fixed entirely on her in a way that made everything else feel distant, and for a second neither of them spoke, the quiet stretching between them, filled with everything that had not yet been said. "You did not have to wait," she said softly, her voice calm but carrying that same uncertainty she had been trying to hide all day, and he shook his head once, his gaze steady, unwavering. "I said I would," he answered, simple, direct, as if that was enough, as if keeping his word was something that mattered now in a way it had not before. The drive back was quieter than the morning, but heavier, the silence filled with something unspoken that pressed gently against the space between them. And Lily found herself holding on to one thought, one realization that had begun to take shape no matter how much she tried to ignore it. This was not temporary. This was not a passing shift. Because Ethan Caldwell was no longer standing at the edge of her life, he was stepping into it fully, and the closer he came, the more she understood something that frightened her more than anything else. If this was real, if he truly meant it, then she would have to decide whether she could stay, not as a shadow, not as a quiet presence, but as his wife, in a way that finally meant something. And she did not know if her heart was ready to risk that kind of truth. That night the house did not feel like a place she could quietly disappear into anymore. Every corner seemed to hold a trace of him. Every silence carried weight, and Lily realized as she stepped inside that the balance she had built over 3 years was already gone, replaced by something uncertain and fragile that made it impossible to pretend nothing had changed. She moved slowly, setting her bag down, her fingers lingering for a second longer than necessary, as if grounding herself in something steady. But her thoughts kept circling back to the same question she had been avoiding. How long would this last? And what would be left when it ended? She heard him behind her before she saw him, his presence no longer distant, no longer separate, and when she turned, he was there, closer than he had ever been without hesitation, his expression calm, but his eyes holding something deeper, something that felt almost restless beneath the surface. "Lily," he said, her name quiet but clear. And the way he said it made her pause, because it was not just recognition, it was intention, and that alone made her chest tighten. She looked at him, really looked this time, searching for something she could trust, something that would tell her this was real, and not just another shift that would disappear without warning. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching but not empty, filled with everything they had never said. "Why now?" she asked softly, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Not accusing, not angry, just honest in a way she had not allowed herself to be before, because she needed to understand. She needed to know if this meant something or if it was just another moment she would have to learn to let go of. Ethan did not answer immediately, and for a second she thought he might not answer at all, that he would retreat back into the distance that had always defined him. But instead he stepped closer, closing the space between them in a way that made it impossible to ignore what was happening. His gaze steady on hers, not avoiding, not deflecting. "Because I was wrong," he said finally, his voice low, controlled, but carrying something that felt heavier than anything he had said before, something that sounded like truth rather than explanation. Lily felt her breath catch slightly, her heart tightening at the simplicity of it, because it was not the kind of answer she expected, not detailed, not explained, just honest in a way that left no room for distance. "About what?" she asked, quieter now, because the moment felt fragile, like something that could break if she pushed too hard, but he did not look away, did not hesitate this time. "About you," he said, and for the first time, there was no distance in his voice, no control masking what he meant, just a quiet certainty that settled into the space between them. He lifted his hand again, slower this time, giving her a chance to step back if she wanted to. But she did not move, her body still, her eyes fixed on his as his fingers brushed lightly against hers. Not holding, not claiming yet, just touching, as if he was learning something new, something he had denied himself for too long. I thought distance made things easier, he continued, his voice softer now, almost thoughtful. I thought if I did not feel anything, then nothing could be taken from me. And there it was, the first real glimpse into the silence he had lived in, the reason behind the walls he had built, and Lily felt something inside her shift, not fully understanding, but seeing enough to know that this was not simple. This was not easy for him either. She swallowed gently, her fingers curling slightly against his without realizing it. And for a moment they stood there, connected in a way that felt small but significant, until she pulled her hand back, not abruptly, not rejecting, but careful, because she needed space to think, to breathe, to understand what this meant for her. I cannot do this if it is just temporary, she said quietly, her voice steady even though her heart was not, because this time she could not go back to being a shadow, could not pretend this meant nothing if it meant everything. Ethan's gaze did not waver, his expression tightening slightly, as if her words reached something deeper than he expected, and for a second the silence returned, but it was different now, not distant, not empty, but filled with a choice that neither of them could avoid anymore, because this was no longer about a contract, no longer about a name. This was about whether he would step forward fully or lose her before he ever truly had her. The silence after her words did not break him, but it changed something in the way he stood, in the way his shoulders lowered just slightly, as if he had finally stopped holding something back, and Lily saw it then, not the composed man the world knew, not the distant husband she had lived beside for 3 years, but someone standing at the edge of a choice he could no longer avoid. Ethan looked at her as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time, not as part of an agreement, not as a presence he could ignore, but as someone who could leave, someone he could lose, and that realization settled into him with a quiet weight that stripped away the last of his distance. It is not temporary, he said, his voice steady but softer than before, not controlled in the same way, not distant, but grounded in something real, and Lily felt her breath pause, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way he said them, without hesitation, without retreat. He stepped closer, not abruptly, not forcing the moment, but with a calm certainty that made it clear he was not stepping back this time. And when his hand reached for hers again, it was different, not testing, not uncertain, but intentional, his fingers wrapping around hers with a quiet firmness that felt steady rather than overwhelming. I was wrong to keep you at a distance, he continued, his gaze never leaving hers, and I will not do that again. And there was no promise of perfection in his voice, no attempt to say the exact right thing, just honesty, simple and unguarded, and somehow that made it easier to believe. Lily searched his expression, looking for any sign that this was something he might take back, something that would fade when it became difficult, but she did not find it, and for the first time, the uncertainty inside her shifted into something else. Something cautious but hopeful, like the beginning of something she had never allowed herself to expect. You do not have to prove anything all at once, she said quietly, her voice gentle but firm, because she needed him to understand that this was not about one moment, not about one decision. It was about everything that came after, everything that would build from here. Ethan nodded once, a small movement, but meaningful, as if he understood more than she expected.